Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. A few days ago, we held the first part of a conversation about the state of play in the Eastern Mediterranean, one of the cradles of human civilization, which of course includes not only spiritual and technological progress, but also friction and conflict. We tried to lay out the various interests and policies of several actors, from Athens and Ankara to Jerusalem, Cairo, and Nicosia. Now in our second part, we will try to do what sailors did in the Med from the time immemorial and peer into the fog, looking for a beacon from some lighthouse before we are grounded on a reef or beach. Joining us from Central Israel to do so is Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, who is a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security as well as at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you very much.
And with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us an understanding with regard to today's topic, also on more of a superpower competition. When we're talking about Russia, about the United States, about China for that matter, how are things actually in this complex territory also impacting Israel and regional actors?
Well, some Americans will take issue with your definition of Russia as a superpower, even though, of course, with the nuclear arsenal that it still has, it is a very potent military power. Not the same goes for its economy, but nevertheless, yes, the Americans do look to China and Russia as their peer competitors. Now, in the Mediterranean, a few days ago, there was a very interesting statement by the chief of the general staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi, in commanding the submarine force of the Israeli Navy. He mentioned, among other challenges, that it has to operate within great power friction. Now, of course, he didn't go into details, but what he obviously meant was that as Israeli submarines have been plying the waters of the Mediterranean along the coast of Syria and perhaps other countries, they had to take care not to tangle with Russian submarines and perhaps others. So this is the military aspect. Obviously, we are on the eve of the onset of the Biden administration. We don't know whether the new president will reverse wholly or partially the policy of his predecessor regarding the withdrawal of American forces, especially boots on the ground, from the Levant and other places in the region. If he does, a vacuum will be left for the Russians, perhaps not for the Chinese military-wise, but the Chinese are coming in with their industries, with their infrastructure projects, and we may see a Russian-Chinese competition here. Now, we mentioned Turkey, and apparently President Erdogan, in being the neo-Ottoman, knows that he should not repeat the mistakes of the Ottomans in overextending their empire. And we have seen only recently so many problems that Turkey got itself into. Nagorno-Karabakh. In Syria, they have a problem with Assad and with the Russians. Libya, they got into. They were not there. It was not some problem which was forced upon them. Greece, Cyprus, exploration in the Mediterranean, France, so many problems. And perhaps this is one reason why there are news reports recently of some rapprochement between Erdogan and Israel, at least some feelers regarding the posting of a new ambassador. There were reports of a visit by the head of Turkish intelligence, Hakan Fidan. It was not confirmed, as usually such reports are not. But nevertheless, it seems as if Turkey understands that if it wants to have a hand in the game, it must be on better relations with all of the players. It cannot boycott Israel.
Dr. Lehrman, I'd like to picture a certain strategic outlook of the Eastern Mediterranean when we're talking about Israel's offshore reservoirs, gas reservoirs. There is, of course, the Tamar and Leviathan. Now Karish Tanin is now in process of development. But the biggest actor that entered to overtake the previous a certain, I don't know if a majority owner, but a minority owner with significant input now is purchased, of course, Noble Energy, purchased by the multinational corporation Chevron. It is looking to move forward on exports to the major market in the region and the European Union. Of course, through the East Med Forum, we're talking about Israel cooperating with Cyprus and Greece, of course, with Egypt and other actors. But Cyprus and Greece are looking to establish a pipeline into Europe, which would establish a diversified market to a certain degree. Now, we have, of course, Russia, which has 77 of its gas exports directed towards Europe, with a big chunk of that, over 50%, going to Germany alone. How is Russia now going to look at the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, and to what degree does it want to get involved in trying to challenge this process at a time when it may substitute certain losses to its economy, considering the fact that its gas exports amount to about 12.5% of its GDP?
Well, there's a paradox here, because from my experience, the Russians have never been very aggressive in pushing the rights of Gazprom upon us when this was still open to negotiation. And I don't think they really see Israel and Cyprus or even Egypt as a real threat to their hold on the northern European markets. The Italian market, the Mediterranean market is significant, but it is not a major element of the Russian equation. But I have to say, when the Americans are in, with Chevron, for example, then we may have a sort of Russian instinct to undermine the Americans, which comes up every time. There's almost I would say, sort of a compulsive reaction by the Russians to an American presence. Chevron in itself is an amazing thing, because for the first 70 years of Israel's existence, none of the sisters, the famous 7, there used to be 7, then they've merged, and I think we are down to 4 or 5. But the big oil companies, the big energy conglomerates, the huge ones, Exxon, once called Esso, and Chevron and BP, which the Iranians interpret as bloody pirates, and Shell, etc. They wouldn't touch Israel with a 10-foot pole, because, of course, that would have given them serious trouble with their Arab providers. Nowadays, with the situation being transformed almost on a daily basis between Israel and much of the Arab world, Chevron can advertise in Israel, invest in Israel, buy an asset, a major asset in Israel, and feel quite at home. So this all, of course, complicates matters to some extent, but the Russian position has a mitigating factor which doesn't necessarily come from sheer economic consideration. The Russians have a sentimental, strategic, national, even religious attitude towards Greece and Cyprus, towards fellow Christian Orthodox nations, the Mother Church, that somehow modifies their policies in the region and have made them very favorable towards the Israeli-Greece Cypriot alignment. Moreover, when it comes to Egypt, the Russians see a prospect of having good relations with this powerful player. And in Libya, for example, where the Americans are either playing intermediary or are out of the game, the Russians have come in on the side of Egypt and France, supporting the Haftar LNA in the Libyan war. So in this one particular front against Turkish meddling and the Muslim Brotherhood, we are in the same boat. On the Brotherhood, Moscow looks upon the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Paradoxically, their Gaza offshoot, Hamas, is treated by the Russians as an interlocutor. But the Muslim Brotherhood as such, because of Chechnya and other reasons, is considered in Russia a terrorist organization. So I think we have significant commonalities with Moscow on a certain set of issues, big differences on others. And we do have an open dialogue at the highest level between the Israeli and Russian leadership. And I think that gives us some leeway looking towards the future.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, when we're looking at the aspects of Russia's involvement, to what degree are the Turkish authorities concerned by the growing influence of Russia in certain areas bordering, of course, with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean? Of course, the reach of Turkey now into the Nagorno-Karabakh / Azerbaijan, looking now also to different adventures there with, of course, some backlash from the Iranians over a poem that classified Azerbaijan and parts of Iran as Turkish territory. Now Turkey is, of course, in the backyard of the Russians. Will we see now the Russians intensify their involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean as a response?
Well, first of all, let me emphasize that Russia is considered as a historical nemesis of the Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire fought 13 times, and unfortunately the Turks never have defeated the Russians. And as a result, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Turkey had to come to the conclusion that it has to align with the Western camp. And of course, nowadays, because of this precious loneliness foreign policy doctrine, we are seeing that Ankara is also conducting a rapprochement towards Russia when they also acquired S-400 missile systems. But while doing that, we cannot say that the Turkish foreign policy entirely began to engage with the Russian foreign policy agenda. In the beginning of our program, for instance, Amir Oren mentioned that Turkish foreign policy is engaging in problems. Well, in Libya, from my perspective, they really succeeded, and I really don't think that they got into a problem, but rather Erdogan can portray this as a huge success for the Turkish foreign policy. Besides that, also for Nagorno-Karabakh. For the first time, if I'm not mistaken, since the First World War, the Turks came back to the Russian backyard, which means to Caucasia. And nowadays, they could liberate, of course, from the Turkish perspective I'm speaking, they could liberate some of the portions of, the vast majority of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And as you mentioned, Mr. Erdogan also mentioned this song called Aras, which is referring to the Aras River, and he referred in the poem that the other side of the Aras River, which means the Iranian Azerbaijan, was taken away by force by the Iranians, and as a result it created a huge problem. So the real name of the game here is that the Turkish administration is not feeling any deterrence from the Russians. They challenged Russia in Syria. Of course, there were Turkish casualties, 34 Turkish soldiers were killed, but at the end of the day, Turkish presence is still there in northern Syria. Turkey challenged Russia in Libya, and they stopped Haftar's offensive towards Tripoli, and they saved the Tripoli government. And now we are seeing that thanks to Turkey's UAVs, the Azerbaijani military basically declared a very important victory against the Armenians, and Turkey could penetrate in Caucasia. And also, from my perspective, this new strategic picture is sending a real clear message to Russians and to Iranians as well. And they are basically, they are very much surprised because Turkey was very much inside of its borders. And under Erdogan, it is going out from its own natural borders. And these countries are trying to figure out how they can basically design a foreign policy towards Turkey. For instance, right after the friction between Iran and Turkey, maybe you are aware of it or not, but the Turkish intelligence agency conducted some operations inside Turkey and they arrested some so-called Iranian agents. It means that whenever there is a friction with Turkey, the Turkish administration seeks to show the other side that the friction itself or the protests that the Iranian government is doing has a price. So when we are looking at the Eastern Mediterranean, given all of these successes in Caucasia and Libya and relative, let me say, success given the existence of the Turks in Syria, I think the Turkish administration is portraying this whole friction and this brinkmanship policy in the Eastern Mediterranean as a huge success because it is conducted against the Cypriots and to Greeks. So Mr. Erdogan is utilizing and exploiting the Turkish foreign policy for his own agenda at home, for the domestic policy purposes.
Even though the arrest of the 11 Iranian agents that you're referring to in light of the abduction of Iranian dissident from Turkish soil, abducting him by various means and then crossing the border into Iran, was conducted because of Iranian actions without Turkish consent on its territory. And this also followed after that a very interesting poll, Mr. Oren, which I would like to hear from you about, a poll within Turkey conducted among 20,000 Turkish respondents on whether you rather have relations between Turkey and Israel or Turkey and Iran. 83% of all respondents would rather have relations with Israel over Iran at a time where there is, of course, no true relations on the political level. Of course, on the business level, it's business as usual. But how do you see this complexities occur? And on the other hand, I'd like also to bring China into the picture. China has been playing a big role now with all of the coronavirus aspects. Used Turkey as a country to test its vaccines. Now it also provided its vaccines to Egypt and other countries in the region. It's slowly integrating more and more of its influence in all kind of countries. Do you see this also expand in the near future?
So just a word about Turkey. We are 10 years already away from the Mavi Marmara incident, and the emotions are not running as high. And within the Turkish public, of course, they are used to seeing many Israelis visit Turkey, Turkish Airlines flying to Ben Gurion Airport as one of the busiest airlines here, probably second only to El Al, when COVID-19 does not impair flight operations. And there is no friction right now between the peoples of Turkey and Israel. Government-wise, yes, people can read about it. But then again, Turkey has so many adversaries right now that Israel is obviously not at the top of the list. And there is no reason for the average Turk to feel enmity towards Israel, even though these are Muslims vis-a-vis Jews. Eytan can probably speak about it much better.
But even though it's Sunni Muslims versus Jews as opposed to Sunni Muslims versus Shiite Muslims, who are a lot more or experience a lot more animosity towards one another historically than towards the Jews themselves.
But there is no basic inbred hostility within the Turkish people against Israelis as such. And we saw that there are problems between the Erdogan government and the Christians. When you take a church or a cathedral and you turn it into a mosque or return it to a mosque, of course, there's a problem. But what you mentioned regarding China has to do with the review of American policy now that the Biden administration will consider its options. China has been portrayed by the Trump administration as enemy number one for the United States. Now, of course, they don't say China, they say the Chinese Communist Party to try and portray some distance between the country or the government and the party. But nevertheless, Biden will have to see how he operates vis-a-vis China, and that includes also the Israeli-Chinese relationship, which we have seen grated on the nerves of various American administrations, going back to the first Bush administration and then Clinton and so on, with various businesses. But let me bring into the discussion one secondary point, the Gaza Strip. If we are going to have some improvement in the relations between Israel and Gaza on humanitarian grounds and other grounds, it will have an impact on the Eastern Mediterranean, on the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean, because Gaza will become a player. Not a major player, but nevertheless, it may have down the road an artificial island as its harbor, and it may have some claims for resource exploration. So this is a point to consider. It is in Israel's interest for Gaza to have something to lose if there is another war. But economically wise, one should consider that Gaza is joining the game.
Well, there is gas reservoirs already identified off the shore of Gaza, and nobody is willing to touch that because of the terrorist factor in the Hamas-controlled enclave. But Dr. Lerman, we don't have very much time left in today's program. I'd like to understand to what degree, considering that the United States is now in the process of a power shift in Washington, of course, policies are going to change to a certain degree, and there's not going to be as much continuity as one may hope between one administration to another. But we do see now the Russians, of course, having a bigger stake in Turkey with their nuclear reactor being developed also in Turkey, but also doing so in Egypt. There is also cooperation with Egypt on multiple levels. And we see that now vacuum may emerge from the United States pullout, which would then provide more room maybe for the Russians/Chinese to enter as they have already voiced interests in doing so. Do you see this now developing in that direction?
Well, it's an interesting question because the Biden administration is beginning to shape up. It's very much a 1945 dispensation advocate. That's to say, when Trump tried to bring down the institutional structure of alliance and American leadership that basically underpinned the world order since 45, the Biden administration, led by Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, I believe will work in the opposite direction, to rebuild the transatlantic as well as a trans-Pacific quad basis of alliance. And this will bring the United States and France, perhaps, into an alignment also in the Eastern Mediterranean. The major advocate of pro-Turkish policies in Washington has left already within the Trump administration. It's very difficult to talk about continuity even within Trump policy because there were so many inconsistencies during the administration's period of office when it comes to Turkey and the Eastern Med. And Pompeo is certainly no friend of Turkey. I would say Jeffrey was, but he's no longer with us, Jim Jeffrey. The Biden administration, there's a reason why Erdogan is doing so much to try and mollify and be nice to the incoming team, because he knows that they have a low opinion of his policies. And if they team up with France as part of a new re-establishment of a transatlantic relationship, this could have an impact also in the Eastern Mediterranean in ways which I would say cohere with Israeli interests.
Mr. Oren, one last sentence. To what degree is Israel heading in the right direction at this stage, again, with an outlook to the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, we haven't spoken about Israel's domestic crisis. Israel has been in a political deadlock for the last 2 years, may still be there a few months from now if we see elections, until a government stabilizes. The national security policy of Israel is basically constant, but the political echelon has to sort itself out, and only in mid-2021 will we know the answer to your question.
Even though it's evident that Israel is diverting its resources from Air Force and other tools at its disposal to a stronger Navy, considering its growing interest in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Only in the margins. It's not really a transformation.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Eran Lerman, Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, and Mr. Amir Oren for today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.